Alright, we couldn't find anything on the internet on how to replace this rear axle. We're gonna make a rear axle replacement video for the GMC Terrain. There was a few videos on front axles that were poorly executed. First step is take off the wheels. Alright, so for your next step, after you take off the wheels, you're gonna come up in here to this nut. That's the nut that's retaining your axle to this hub. So you're gonna blast off that nut, and we'll get to the next part. Alright, so now that you've got your axle nut off, you just want to come up in here and give this a tap. Make sure it moves. If it doesn't move, you'll have to do some pounding. Mine moves. You just want to make sure that it's not seized in there. Otherwise, you're going to have a horrible time getting it off if you unbolt everything. That one moved. It's a little sticky, but we'll tolerate it. Just to go through, and you'll undo this bolt here, and you'll undo this bolt here. Those are both the bottom bolts on the knuckle here. You want to leave this one alone. Don't touch this one, because if you undo that one, that spring's going to push this whole arm down, and you'll have to set the car down to get it back on. Pretty strong spring. Maybe if you're lucky and you do it by accident, this thing will hold it up, but that's plastic, so I wouldn't have too many hopes on it. Alright, well I guess instead of unbolting it here, this is a bushing that runs all the way through to the end of this. So when you unbolt that, it doesn't really want to come off. So instead of unbolting that arm right there, we're going to come over and unbolt it here and slide it out of the truck right there. So I guess go ahead and skip unbolting that one, but do unbolt this one. As you can see, it is released right here. Even with the shock being still attached, it still pushed itself down a little bit, so we'll have to get something underneath it and lift it up a little bit to get back on this knuckle. So we've taken off the bolt here, and as you can see, this is not a circle, it's an oval, which means it's an alignment bolt. You can see where the bolt was here. You can see the paint where it was on top of. So basically when we go to put this back together, we're going to make sure our nut is perfectly on top of that paint. That way this guy doesn't have to go get an alignment. Alright, so after you've taken that bolt out, you've got a good idea of where your alignment marks are. Everything's pretty loose, but it still won't move. That's because of this link right here. So the next thing you're going to do is you're going to come up here and you're going to take off this brake line right here. It's got a nut on each side. Go ahead and take off that brake line, and then you'll come over here to where these 3 bolts are bolted to the knuckle, and you'll take them off on right there. There they are. 1, 2, 3. Right there, you'll take those off, and that should give you full swing to get the axle out. Unbolted. I've already got my axle out here, but just to show you, you're just going to come down here to the side of this, and you're going to pick this thing all the way up to the top of the wheel well here, and then the axle will just fall right out. Boom, just like this. Over here, it wasn't the case. It's pretty rusty inside there, so we're going to get that lubed up real quick and give it a couple taps with the hammer, and then we'll do the same thing on this side. Now you've got both axles hanging on both sides here. You're going to come up here with your pry bar and stick it in the middle right there onto the axle housing. And you're going to give it a pop. Give it a couple pops. If it doesn't pop, rotate it and pop it again. You can see the axle seals coming out with this one. That's not supposed to happen, but we'll deal with it in a second. Here we got another one. I've already popped this one. So pretty much the rest of the procedure is just putting them back in. We'll check out this one where the seal came off and see what we can do about it. Alright, so we've just got our axles barely in. We haven't smacked them in yet, but basically it's just the opposite of taking it apart. You lift that up, you stick the middle in, and then while that's lifted up, you take the outside of the axle, put it on the hub here. Has to happen in that order, or else you'll sit there fighting with it for a while. But yeah, so the next step, we're going to go ahead and wait to pop these in until we get a few other things bolted on. Pretty much we're just going to work backwards now. We're going to put these 3 bolts back on. We're going to put that brake line back on. And then we'll move back down to here. We're going to do this bolt last. We've got to adjust it for alignment. So I'll show you what happens with that. Alright. So now that you've got those 3 on and that one in and everything's nice and tight, we're going to go ahead down here on both sides, and we're going to put this one on. We're gonna put this one back on if you accidentally took it off with me. And then we're gonna put this one on. And during that entire process, we're gonna get all 3 of them installed before we tighten anything down. That way we can make the movements that we need to over here to get this back onto its perfect little circle there. Finally got everything through. He's blasting that on real quick. Now this sucker's nice and tight. It was one of the last ones we're tightening. The last one's right there. And go ahead and give those a good tighten, Sam. And then this was the first one we tightened. You can see we have it pretty much perfectly lined up with that ring that was there underneath it. You can see a little bit out there on the, oh no, that's just some shadow. We're good. 100% on. Come over to this side. Look back there, you can't see the black ring. You can't see the black ring anywhere, so this is how you know that you are back on alignment. If you don't get that back on, you'll start destroying tires prematurely. So it has to go back in the same spot if you don't have that little black ring like I did, because you got a newer car and it's perfectly clean down here, which is probably not, but in case that's the way it happened, you're probably going to have to go get an alignment after this if you can't get that bolt back on exactly where it was. Now that you've got all 3 of these on and tight, all 3 of those are on, everything's bolted back together, you've got your brake line here, you've put these 3 bolts back on, everything's nice and tight. We're good to go ahead and pop the axles in the rest of the way. You can see we've got them hanging out. So we're just going to put our nut on here so that this is a nice flat surface and we're not going to damage it with our hammer. And then we're just going to slowly spin the wheel and give this some taps in until it finally goes in. If you're tapping this and it's not going in, you need to rotate the wheel and try again, because you're probably bound up and you're going to destroy something if you keep smashing this thing in. And you should never be hitting it hard enough to damage the threads. It should just be a couple taps and going in. Alright, so after you've gone through and gotten everything bolted on and tapped your axles in, this is what you should be looking at. You can see that there's just, you know, a cunt hair of space between the axle and the diff. There's that one. And then the last thing you're going to do is you're going to torque this nut. It's probably going to be a different torque spec for whatever axle you're using. We noticed that the axles have different sized nuts from new axle to old axle, and they have a different flange. You can see this one has this little bump here, whereas the new one's completely round. So torque this as to the axle specification. If you can't find one, go to the dealer and do it. Ask them. And then the last step is going to be to put the wheel on and torque it down to 90 pounds, and then you're ready to hit the road with your new axles.